What it is, Jacob Patterson Wilmo again, and I'm going to teach you the easiest way I know to create a simple 2 or 3 level stencil.
So the first thing that you want to make sure that you're doing is selecting an image that has a high enough contrast. You can definitely make a stencil out of an image with any contrast, but a higher contrast is going to make it easier. So I have 3 pictures here, all 3 of the same model, and as you can see, this one here has the best contrast. It just so happens to be the coolest picture as well, but you can see that there's really light lights, really dark darks, and that's something that I want to do. So I have it ready for us here in Photoshop. One of the first things you'll notice is that if you open a JPEG or PNG in Photoshop, it's going to be put into a layer that's locked as a background. So what you can do is press Command or Control A. That'll select everything, Control C and Control V, and it'll copy and paste a new layer. So you can make your background layer invisible, at which point we'll get to the next step, which is resizing the image. This is a good time to point out that stencils, since you're going to be cutting it yourself by hand a lot of the time, it doesn't really matter if it's really blurry and pixelated. So depending on how trained of an eye you have, you can pretty much work with any image, no matter the size. This image looks like it's around 7 by 5 inches. I'm going to adjust it to the size that I want it at. After you adjust the canvas size, you can just hit Control or Command T and that'll bring up Transform, and you can adjust the image to fit your canvas. If you're working with an image that has color, I highly suggest you desaturate it first. So on a Mac you can hit Control Shift and U and that'll desaturate the image for you, or you can just go to Hue and Saturation and bring the saturation slider all the way to 0. But even if you are planning to spray this in color, it's better in my opinion to just choose the colors yourself and desaturate the image before you get started. Then you're going to want to go to brightness and contrast. Most of these alterations can just be found in the image adjustments drop down, but contrast and brightness is going to be something that's very important because you need something that has a high contrast. So you're going to move the contrast up and down until you get the image to look how you want it to, and you're also going to be using brightness the whole time you're doing that. So just mess around with it a little bit until you get the image to look how you want it to. As you can see here, I got an eyelid that I didn't even know existed in the photo. It looks really good, makes it look a lot sexier when we're going to try to bring that out. The next thing we're going to do is going to make our lives a hell of a lot easier for you. This is pretty much where Photoshop does all the work. They have an adjustment called posterize, which pretty much just sets it up into however many layers of a stencil you want it to be. The thing is, it never looks as good as you can make it look yourself. So the better you get, the more you'll realize what you want to do. You'll play with the levels. We're going to cut like a 3 or 4 layer stencil. However, we're going to probably put it around 7 layers and then choose where we want those layers to be cut. And as you can see, there's multiple grays in here, but I'm only going to cut 3 of them. So you kind of want to make sure you get all the colors you need without putting too many so that it's not too hard to see once you're cutting. Another really important thing is that you need to remember you're building up from a base layer onto a topmost layer. So our base layer is obviously going to be black because it's got this whole like sea of black that all of the islands of shades are kind of floating in. So we want to keep as little black islands as possible. And what that means is when you look in here at her nose, there's an island of black, and I'm trying to do this without having to spray any layers twice. So we're going to build a bridge here between the shadow on her nose and the shadow on her upper lip. All of these other shades are kind of floating. You can pick and choose what shades stay and what shades go. You don't necessarily have to cut all of it, and you'll see that I won't. But one of the more important things is that if you're trying to keep your number of layers low, it's best to find places where there's a bridge and another shade that goes over that bridge. But one of the most important things for trying to keep your amount of layers low is that if you're going to build a bridge, you want to try to put it somewhere you can mask it by having another layer that shows up later kind of going over it. So you'll see here that there's a white that kind of goes over the place that I'm going to build the bridge between her nose and upper lip, and that's going to cover it as much as possible. Next, you just go to print, you make sure it fits on your page correctly, and you choose the number of copies that you're going to print. I usually print a couple of extra layers so I don't need to go back to the printer if I mess up. As you can see, my image didn't go all the way to the top, so I had to draw a little bit in, but it wasn't too rough. So then I'm just going to cut my first layer, which is technically my second layer because I'm just going to use a solid black base, but it's usually the easiest one to cut. And obviously, if you've ever cut anything, you'll know that you just want to pull it downwards and switch out your blades as often as possible, because once the blade starts getting dull, you'll start making more mistakes. Another point at which you want to try to avoid mistakes is when there's little kind of like detail work. The piece you're trying to cut will often get caught, and you don't want to just yank it off because you can tear off a piece that's supposed to stay on that layer. And mistakes when you're cutting a stencil are usually where you lose the most time. So switch out your blades as often as you need to. Be really careful because they are very sharp, and if it starts getting dull and you're noticing you have to pull it too hard, you probably want to switch it, because not only are you risking a mistake and cutting a part out of the stencil that you don't want cut out, but you're risking having to pull it too hard, it gets caught on something, and then cutting yourself, which I've done before. So your first layer will pretty much just be cutting out everything that's not your base. And then your second layer is when you start making the decisions. As you can see here, there's a pretty even divide. We have the darkest color gray right at the front, and then there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 other shades. And then in here, they get really close together. So that's where we're gonna have to decide where we wanna cut it ourselves. We're not just gonna trace any line, we're gonna choose something that's kind of in between that uses multiple shades and shows the most of her face, so that it makes sense when we spray out all 3 of the layers together. So I'm going to kind of go in between. As you can see, there's a couple layers of shades in there, and I'm just going to choose wherever I think looks the best. The next thing you'll do is trace out what you drew the first time around. You just trace it onto your next layer and then draw something inside that kind of looks good for your second layer, and then cut that. It's important once you start getting done with layers that you store them correctly, because they do tear so easily. So you're going to want to put a piece of paper between each layer, or multiple pieces of paper depending on how big your stencil is, just to make sure that they don't get caught on each other and tear each other up. The last layer for this stencil is going to be our white color, which is actually like a lighter gray since this is a really dark picture. And I'm just kind of choosing where I want the highlights to be. I have a knowledge of how it's going to look in the end, but for most of the stuff that you're doing, you'll have a high enough contrast that you can just literally trace the white. Then we're going to choose our shades of gray. I always use Montana Gold because it's really dusty. You can use other really wet paints or cheap, crappy paints if you want to, but for the most success in spraying stencils, I've noticed that Montana Gold is the best paint. I always start with Shock Black as my darkest color, and then just kind of grab a bunch of stuff from there and then choose what's the best grayscale. I'm using the caps that come with it. It's just like a medium cap. You don't really need anything else if you're doing a stencil, because I'm not trying to get any fine lines or anything like that. The fine lines are made by what we cut. And then you just kind of line them up and you choose what colors are going to be best, what makes your best grayscale based on how many layers you need. Since your cans are typically going to have a bunch of spray paint on top of them, you can't just look at what's on top. Plus the shade doesn't necessarily match what's going to come out of the can, so you're going to want to test it somewhere. Luckily I have a table that I can just spray on and lay out my shades in line to see if it makes sense. Another reason you want to do this is because you want to make sure that the paint is flowing properly out of the can, because you can really screw up a piece if you don't check that first. So it looks like I'm chosen some pretty good colors. You can see here that I'm testing a new can. I've shaken the hell out of these things, but the paint is still having a hard time coming out. So make sure you test the flow first before you start spraying anything on your canvas. Another good thing about spray paint is that it covers pretty much anything, so you don't have to use a canvas. I just went in my studio and found some old piece of wood and covered it with a base coat of black and went from there. When you're spraying, you don't want to just hold the tip down. You'll learn can control, but that's probably the hardest thing to learn. So you kind of want to do a little like not just a steady stream of paint, because on either end of the zigzag pattern that you're going down the canvas with, if you're just holding it, it's going to double up the paint right there, and it'll get really thick and you'll get drips and ugly stuff like that. So try to learn how to be light with a can. It's an acquired skill, so just be patient. I'm still not the best. Once you've got your base coat down, you've got your colors chosen, you'll grab a spray adhesive. This is one of the more important parts. I use 3M Super 77. After you try out a couple, you'll decide which one you like. I found that this is the best for what I do when I'm using regular old printer paper. You want to spray it really lightly on the back, so don't get it very close, just spray it kind of from a distance. I sprayed way too much right here, and I could have torn my stencil because of it. It's good to just spray a light little coat on the back, flip it over, and then try to get some of the excess glue off of it. Another important thing to do is to give it a test run, not on the canvas, because you don't know if it looks right yet. But I won't spoil the surprise too bad. I know you can see it up there in the corner, but I'm going to show you now how to actually spray the stencil once it's on the canvas, now that I've given it my test run. The first layer is probably the most important because it's deciding where on the canvas your image is going to be. On all edges of your stencil, you want to put down a piece of paper and some weight to hold it down, because you don't want it to spray under there and get overspray on your canvas. And then, like I said, you want to go really, really lightly, as straight down on the stencil as possible. You don't want it to overspray and you don't want it to cake up paint, because at that point the paint is going to start going somewhere that you don't want it to on your canvas. So spray lightly and then pull up your stencil very slowly, because there is glue on it and you can pull up the layers underneath if you go too quickly. Once you've sprayed a layer, you'll note that both the front and back are sticky, both from the paint and the spray adhesive. So you want to put a piece of plastic or paper on either side and keep checking it to make sure it's not stuck, because if that dries, your stencil is going to get torn and you can't make multiple prints. Another thing is that it will curl because of the change in temperature, so you might want to put a little bit of weight on it too, but you got to be careful because, like I said, it can get stuck and tear. So in between each layer, put a piece of paper or plastic. Next, you want to line up your next layer. You shouldn't see 2 layers back from what you're painting. So I have this second tone of gray. I should only see a tone of gray. I shouldn't see any black. There are places where this layer goes all the way to the black, but they're minimal and you want to keep that as rare as possible. It's never going to be perfect, but you want to get it as close to perfect as you can. So you just kind of line it up. You try to make sure that it's covering the gray beneath it correctly. With one piece of paper, it's usually pretty easy. And you want to check for spots like this, where it's not all the way down to the canvas and paint can get underneath, because at that point you're going to get overspray, and that's when it starts to look unprofessional. So as you can see, it's up quite a bit. I'm going to pat it down lightly, not too hard, because I don't want it to get too stuck and tear up the gray paint underneath. And then give it a light coat of this shade, making sure I don't get overspray beneath that piece of paper up at the top. Like I said, the change in temperature makes this paper curl, so it will curl up after it gets the paint on top. And I'm going to get some overspray right here. You'll notice once I pull it up that it looks a little fuzzy around the edges. That's not something you want unless you're going for kind of like a glowing look. It's pretty straightforward from here. I'm going to test my paint every time to make sure that it's not water coming out, and then I'm going to spray the next shade on top. So it's done now and it's ready for a finisher. I typically use a glossy finisher, but this piece was pretty shiny already, and I don't want there to be too much glare, so I'm going to end up using the matte finisher. Then you just give it a nice even coat, and you're done. You just wait for it to dry.
Once all that's off, hats off to a true life artiste, Jacob Patterson. Subscribe, he's a beast. When you walk down the street, you gotta have art on your feet. These are so much more than sneakers.